All right, hello everyone, and welcome to our video today to talk about the circular flow model in economics, where we look specifically at what aggregate demand and aggregate supply are and how they impact each other, how they influence the overall level of spending and activity in the economy, which helps us then be able to understand how the government's three goals are affected by the overall level of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So we'll look specifically at how it's calculated, all the different things that affect it, and then we'll be able to link that in later with how it affects things like inflation, full employment, and economic growth. So let's get right into it now with what aggregate demand is. So far in economics, whenever we've looked at demand, it's always been about one specific product in a market. Whereas when we talk about aggregate demand, it refers to all demand for all goods and services in the economy. So the total level of all demand. So we define it as aggregate demand is the total value of expenditure on all goods and services in an economy. So it's all spending. So basically all the incomes that people receive, when they spend that on goods and services, that creates the total level of demand. As you could probably predict, producers and suppliers then create goods and services based on the level of demand that exists. So that then ties in exactly with our aggregate supply, which is aggregate supply being the total value of all production of all goods and services in an economy over a period of time. So aggregate supply is just the total value of all production overall. So it ends up being pretty simple. So aggregate demand, aggregate being all, so all demand or total demand, aggregate supply, all supply, total supply. So they're pretty simple concepts. It's just we're moving from looking at specific markets. So when we're looking at microeconomics, we're looking at specific markets. These things are macroeconomic factors. So we're looking at the whole economy or all of the demand or all of the supply in one country. So then when we start to look at these and how they interact and what they're affected by, we look at what's called the circular flow model. So this is illustrating how the Australian economy works and how parts of it are interrelated. And additionally, it identifies some of the macroeconomic variables that affect our country's economic conditions. So basically, we're going to be looking at how we get incomes, and when we get incomes, where it goes, and how the total level of demand is created. So we're going to look at it. It's a big, scary diagram to start with. If I was doing this in a classroom, as I traditionally would, I tend to draw it in parts, but due to the fact that we're doing this through a PowerPoint and animating it would have been a very long and tedious thing, and I just want to explain it through to make it make the most sense possible. We're going to do it like this. So hopefully you've seen a diagram that's similar to half of this before. So hopefully you've seen this top half somewhere before, because we have definitely talked about this top half before, about the household sector and the business sector and how they interact. And this just goes into that in a bit more detail. I'm actually surprised how well that red highlighter works. All right, so two main sectors, so the household sector and the business sector, and we always talk about what households provide to businesses, and most of the time we just talk about, people tend to just jump to the thing that's labor. Labor is one of the most common ones, so that's fair enough, but we talk about it as being the supply of resources to the business sector. So we'll see here that the households provide resources to the business sector, and it goes that way. Those resources can be more than just labor. Labor is the most common one, but we can also provide, say, resources. So say we have land or we are providing resources, we can sell those to the business sector, or we can provide them capital. So any form of resource we can provide them, the most common example being labor. Labor is the one that we provide the most often. And then what does the business sector do in return for our resources that we provide them? They pay us an income. So that income can be a salary, it can be rent, it can be just paying for the capital that we've provided them. So we get an income back from them, and you see that go this way through that flow too, and that goes to the household sector. And that's the first main thing that occurs. So we provide resources to the business sector and they give us an income in return. And so then we look at, so the household sector gets our income, comes in, and then it kind of goes from this point here and across over here. And then we start to look at, well, what do we do with our income? The most common thing that people think about us doing with our income is what we call private consumption spending. And so about 70% of our income goes towards private consumption spending. On average, like I say that because private consumption spending makes up 70% of all demand, all of aggregate demand. So a lot of our money goes there. But there are some other things that happen to our income when we get it too. So sometimes we will save some of that money, and we call that private savings. Sometimes some of that money will go to tax. Well, not sometimes, a lot of it will. Like if I looked at my pay this week, a lot of my pay went to tax, like 34% of it, which is significant. And then we also have, sometimes we spend money on imports. And although you are still getting goods and services from imports, the difference between this and private consumption spending is with private consumption spending, that money is staying in Australia. So with private consumption spending, to start using props, you take that money and it just goes somewhere else in Australia. Whereas when you do import spending, you take that money, you transfer it into some other currency. Actually, I can do that too. So when you do import spending, you take that Australian money and then you transfer it into a foreign currency and it goes there. Look at this, props, brilliant. And so that money actually leaves the economy and it doesn't actually stimulate the Australian economy. So all these three things here, we actually refer to as leakages. So if we were to circle these things here, these are areas that our money can go, and we call them leakages because it's actually money that is either leaving our economy or it's not being spent in our economy right now. And therefore it's not actually contributing to the overall level of demand. So if you think about the fact that like when you save some money, which is a very good thing, you should definitely do that. As I continue writing leakages very poorly, you should definitely save some money. Saving is good. It will help you out later in life. But that money's not stimulating the economy right now. That money's going somewhere else. And so all of these things we refer to as leakages because they actually decrease the amount of demand in the economy because that money's not being used right now. So savings, you're having that money put aside to use at a later date. You're saving it. Eventually it will contribute, but right now it's not. Government tax, same kind of idea. That money is being taken away from your income and the government has it, but they're not spending it yet. So in the short term, it's not contributing to the economy. In the future, when they plan spending, they announce it in the budget, they spend on infrastructure, whatever, that is going to stimulate the economy. But the tax is money that you could have spent that is now not contributing to the economy. And then lastly, we've talked about import spending, going to a different economy, not actually benefiting ours. So then with each of these things, we have an opposite effect. So in the financial sector, we have savings, and then on the other side, we have what's called private investment spending, which I'm going to highlight in blue. So private investment spending is all about businesses investing and expanding money. So they might be borrowing money to then buy plant and equipment or expand overall. And so this is money coming from outside of the household sector, coming into the economy. So everything else that we looked at so far is from the household sector and things that the household sector are doing. These three components here, which apparently me pointing to my screen does not really translate in the video, so I'm going to try and stop doing that, is these things are coming into the economy from a different location and are going to stimulate it, create more demand overall. So private investment spending, businesses borrowing money for and then investing money in like plant and equipment, etc., that creates more demand overall because that's more spending in the economy. Government spending, so things like the government spending on infrastructure comes into here also. So that's a very big thing. So government spending on, say, like the Westgate Tunnel, that's a big piece of government spending that creates demand in the economy. So that's money coming from an outside source, the government, injected into the economy. And then lastly, export spending. I'm going to be able to get my props out again. Export spending is when other countries take their currency. So they take their currency and then they demand some Australian goods and services. And so they have to take their currency and translate it into Australian currency. And then they use that Australian currency to buy our goods and services. That Australian currency stays in Australia. So that stimulates our economy when they buy exports. And then all of this together, all of this added up together, we end up with an equation. We end up with what we call the aggregate demand equation, which is aggregate demand is equal to consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. And that gives us a dollar value for the overall amount of expenditure, the total value of expenditure in the economy. You might notice from that equation that we are ignoring two of these. So if we looked at to circle those, we're ignoring savings and tax when we do that equation. And the reason why we're ignoring those is because, like I said before, that's money that's not being spent now that might be injected into the economy at a later date through government spending or consumption spending. So in the short term, they don't affect the economy, and so we don't include them right now because it's money that's you've still got it or someone still has it and it's going to be used later on. So then these three items on the left here, so private investment spending, government spending, and export spending, we call these injections to the economy because they are money coming into the economy from a different source. So I'm going to do a dodgy writing of injections there. And so all these things together create the overall level of demand. And what do you think happens from there? So from there, the overall level of demand is kind of filtered onto the business sector, sends a signal to the business sector, hey, there is a significant amount of demand, this dollar value amount of demand, we should produce that amount of goods and services because then there are no shortages, there's no surpluses, everything perfectly meets. So we end up flowing on through and get to this flow 4, which is production. So the total production of all goods and services, which we also refer to as aggregate supply. And then that flows back onto the household sector. So because we purchase those goods and services, and then the business sector has to produce them. So it goes back to the household sector. We have to provide them with resources. They provide us with an income. We spend our income in those various ways. That creates the overall amount of demand, which then leads to the overall amount of production. And it just flows on and on forever and keeps production going overall. And so on the next slide here, I always include it because when I initially made this diagram, I tried to do it by hand. I had an iPad at the time, and I thought drawing this by hand would be way quicker and it'll look way nicer. And then so what we actually got was this mess. And so kind of in kind of homage to that, I tried to draw a nicer one on my whiteboard here, which, look, it's not horrible. It's better than the one just there. So I'm going to be happy with that for now. And it helped me kind of like go through it all in my head earlier. So shout outs to mini whiteboards. They are a useful teaching tool for myself and yourself if you have one at home. All right, and so that's essentially what we're going to talk about for this. So if you want to know more about any of these things, you don't really, you could go through the rest of these slides, but I'm not going to do that right now because we have gone through in a good amount of detail, and the rest of this is just kind of reiterating the things that we went through before. So things like the household sector, providing resources, the business sector paying incomes, the financial sector being savings and investment, the government sector takes tax, spends it on infrastructure, then the overall C sector being imports and exports. And then it just talks about those 4 flows, which we've already talked about. And that is just about it. So the very last point is about aggregate supply. So aggregate supply, the one other point that's important to make about it is that it's especially affected by the availability of a nation's resources and the efficiency which these are used. So this limits our potential for growth in the short term, meaning that we have a productive capacity. There's only a certain amount of goods and services that we can produce. And so in the short term, if demand gets too high, we're going to run into shortages, and then there could be issues that happen around things like price. So that could cause inflation. Things like that are going to be very, very important when we look into the 3 goals of the government: low inflation, full employment, and economic growth. Either way, I hope this has been helpful for you. If you have any questions at all, feel free to leave me a comment or send me a message, send me an email. Anything that I can do to help you would be excellent. Other than that, thank you for listening to me talk about the circular flow model and aggregate demand and aggregate supply for 15 minutes of your life. I hope you have an excellent day, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.